Let's talk about the best practices. Well, there's a lot of them, so I have organized these best practices into 3 buckets. The first bucket is called preparing for the project. The second bucket is called executing the project. And the third bucket is called ending the project. So we're going to step through these best practices that I have seen, and hopefully it will shed some light on some of the challenges ahead and how to address those. So let's start with preparing for the project. Now there's 3 slides here. I'm going to move kind of quickly through here so that we can cover everything in this webinar. But let's start with preparing for the project. Well, the very first thing you need to do if you're considering doing offshore development and you're going to find a partner company to do that is spend time assessing their offshore capabilities. And one very important note here is this. Very few offshore companies are experienced in Agile methods. Let me state that again. Very few offshore companies are experienced in Agile. What you might do is just ask a simple open-ended question. Tell me about your use of Agile methods. If you hear an answer like, well, we just code as fast as possible, then I have one word of advice for you: run. If you hear an answer like, well, we use a very disciplined approach of 2-week iterations, we work things in the highest priority order, we do some test-driven development and continuous integration, we want you to be very actively involved because when your requirements change, we want to be aware of that, then my advice for you is obviously you've probably got a good one. Dive deeper and see if it makes sense for a business relationship with that company. A couple of other good questions as you're assessing their Agile capability. Here's one. How do you react to changing requirements? If the answer is, ooh, well, we were hoping you would identify all of those up front, then the team is probably not very agile. If the answer is, well, when you change requirements, we go through a prioritization activity and we either stop the current iteration to work your highest priority or we prioritize that at the top of the list for the very next iteration 2 weeks later, then that's a really good answer. Another good question, do you deliver incrementally or at the very end? If the answer is, well, just trust us, at the very end we'll deliver something exactly what you wanted, then that's not a very good answer. So in a nutshell, align with the company that has some real verifiable experience using Agile methods in an offshore partnership. A little side note here about CMM Level 5 compliance. You'll see some from various Indian companies a very proud statement about compliance with CMM Level 5. And that while it does show a good discipline of quality, one thing to consider there is that Agile methods are not necessarily contradictory to CMM Level 5. But if the CMM Level 5 basically explains the old-fashioned waterfall model, which is easier to describe than Agile, then I would advise you to keep searching because you can do better. So once again, CMM Level 5 compliance, if it is truly a standard waterfall approach, keep searching, you can do better. You can find a company that does have some Agile experience. Also, verify the offshore partner's infrastructure. Hold some trial teleconferences. Set up some preliminary video conferences. Do some email pings and measure their response rate. Do some IM conversations. If you experience any issues with latency or delay or sound, rest assured those will be magnified greatly during your development. So that's a red flag if you see that. Okay. Obviously, plan and budget in some Agile training. If your team is not familiar with Agile, there are many companies that offer Agile immersion boot camp type training up front. And ideally, if your team is split between local and remote, use the same coach or trainer to deliver the training locally and remote, because the context for their training is already set and they'll be able to leverage that. Obviously, a best practice is to meet face-to-face and build trust, but make sure it's not just a get-to-know-you type meeting. These face-to-face meetings up front, there should be some project deliverables associated with that. For example, a shared project vision, establishing that, or further elicitation of the requirements, or even to do some initial release planning, and yes, even iteration 1 development. Let's move to the second slide associated with preparing for the project. Test-driven development. Test-driven development helps the team find defects earlier. This is where the software engineers actually write unit test cases prior to the code. Then they run their code and fail the test case. Then they add the minimal amount of code to make that test case pass. And all the while they're doing this, they're refactoring ruthlessly. It's a really interesting approach that is gaining some traction out there in the software development world. Well, the big payoff is you find defects earlier, and everybody knows finding defects earlier in the life cycle is less expensive and much better from a quality perspective. So that's the big payoff. TBD may take the team about 10 to 20% longer from a development perspective, but you have to balance that with finding the defects earlier. Well, a recent Microsoft research report showed that if a team creates 10 defects in 1,000 lines of code using TDD, it will actually create 26 to 42 defects in 1,000 lines of code when not using TDD. So the ratio is about 2 to 4 times more defects when not using TDD.
Mike, let me interject. Let me add one question. That's just some people have requesting if you can repeat some of the deliverables for a face-to-face meeting part that you were covering.
Okay, face-to-face meetings. Some of the deliverables, which actually I'll cover in my third slide on preparing the project, but they're along the lines of the shared project vision is one. Another one is establishment of the requirements. That's always good to do with face-to-face meetings. Another one is the initial release plan. And another one, which I'll talk about in just a minute, is even do the first iteration from a combined team perspective all at the same site. And like I said, I'll cover these off a little bit more in the very next slide. As a matter of fact, is slide 13. I'll give you a final summary of that. So let's move on. Continuous integration. And by the way, thank you for that question. That was very good.